Hello and welcome to New Economic Thinking. I'm here today with the Governor of the Central Bank of Ireland, Dr. Patrick Honohan. Dr. Honohan, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thanks for inviting me.
We have had a number of discussions about central banking and issues of shared sovereignty. Ireland has a rather interesting experience because, of course, for all the talk about coups being engineered, for example, in Italy, or changes of government being engineered in Greece, Ireland had its own brush, shall we say, with national sovereignty, and you were in fact at the centre of that when the bailout came around, and you had rather tense negotiations with Jean-Claude Trichet, then head of the ECB. Do you want to elaborate set the stage for us, elaborate a little bit on it?
We were heading down the road of quite a lot of financial difficulty after 2007, 2008, when our property bubble collapsed, and then the banks were bailed out, the cost of which only became generally evident to the markets towards the middle of 2010. At that point, they looked also at the prospective government deficit on ordinary account, and they thought, I wonder, is Ireland going to make it? Irish government had already been adopting quite a lot of fiscal contraction to offset the loss of tax revenue, which had been boom-related, tax revenue from selling houses, furnishing them, capital gains tax. All of that vanished, leaving a big hole in the budget. So going into August, September, October of 2010, the markets started to lose confidence in Ireland, and the danger that Ireland would have to pay higher and higher interest rates was looming, and at a certain point, this would not have been sustainable. So, encouraged by all the partners, European partners, international partners, to enter a program, seemed to policymakers in Ireland, including myself, that this was a safe thing to do, that we would get protection from market anxieties, unjustified market anxieties, because we felt the policies that were in place would actually bring the economy round and adjust the fiscal imbalances. So we did go into a program, but there were obviously, as there are on these things, quite a lot of tension around that time.
Sound and fury, perhaps they did signify something. Specifically, I'm referring to the letter exchange between you and Jean-Claude Trichet. I think he suggested that Irish banks would be cut off from ELA assistance if Ireland did not enter a proper bailout program.
Well, yes. So Jean-Claude didn't write to me. He wrote to the Minister for Finance. He wrote twice. He wrote early in this process, towards, I won't remember the dates now offhand, but several weeks before the bailout.
It's not a parliamentary committee.
No, but somebody will. And he said, no, this is not going well, and you should really do something, particularly about the level of bank borrowing from the ECB, which is a matter of direct concern to the ECB. The Irish banks had borrowed effectively, in the end, the Irish banks borrowed well over 100% of GDP from the ECB system, and they were worried about it. They shouldn't have been worried about it, because the policies were in place to bring that right, but they were worried about it. And then, as the negotiations about entry into the program, the Irish government wasn't sure about how it could convince the Irish people that this was necessary, so they felt a little bit rushed, reluctant to commit themselves. Famously, I went on the radio and said, look, to the general public who were running from the banks at the rate of a billion a day, I said, well, really, this is going to be all right, because the foreign lenders are prepared to lend us money, and I hope this will be done. Even after that, the ECB wasn't convinced that the Irish government would actually sign up to a formal application. So it was at that point that Jean-Claude Trichet wrote to the Minister of Finance saying, well, there's ELA, your banks are reliant on this, and we couldn't continue to authorize this. I don't see that as it's certainly interesting from the point of view of the relationship between the ECB and Ireland. It actually wasn't, I think, in itself an influential action for what the Irish government did. The Irish government are already well on the way to making that application.
But do you think it was necessary, for example, to pay 100 cents on the dollars to the bondholders? Because, of course, that was not one of the issues. I mean, I think that's been the center of the debate.
Yeah. So there are two, we have to be quite clear, there are two different points at which the Irish government didn't bail-in bondholders. The first time was in September 2008. Ireland was a AAA country, just after Lehman's, and there was a loss of access of the banks. And all the banks' liabilities, including subordinated debt, old debt, all guaranteed in a very sweeping gesture, government not realising what a hole that it was creating for itself. And ultimately that hole will probably net out at around 40 billion, which is about 25 or even 30% of national output, which is a big sum of money for one of the really big fiscal costs of a banking crisis. That was a homegrown decision. But subsequently, in November 2010, when the bailout was being negotiated, there was the idea coming from the IMF staff, but not supported in general by the other lenders, that bail-in of the unguaranteed, the bank guarantee was over. There were still old debts that were unguaranteed, and maybe these should be bailed in. And so there's a lot of discussion in the margins around that, even though atypically the Troika had not agreed on this. The IMF staff brought it to the table, even though it was not accepted. Now, the Irish government would have been very happy to do that at that stage, more than happy to do it, particularly with the endorsement of the international lenders. But in the end, the lenders backed away. Even the IMF backed away. As I mentioned this morning at a session, if we can see Tim Geithner's memoir, he mentions that he himself was very vocal in saying that this idea of a bail-in of actually what would have been a relatively small residual amount was unwise for Europe. It would have been wise for Ireland. So that was an episode which I think rankled and rankles.
But in the larger scheme of things, you don't think it was that significant?
Well, I don't think it. I think it was important for the principle of bail-in. I think it was the last act of the people who were hesitant about bail-in, and now in Europe, the idea of the resolution of banks can involve bail-in is obviously accepted. It's now in legislation. From the Irish point of view, subsequently, although the initial bailout was a very large sum of money, but the interest rates were very high. They were 5.8% was the number I remember. And it didn't look very sustainable at that point. On the Irish side, we felt, let's take this and try to negotiate all that situation in a better way. And that negotiation over time was successful, including on the cost of financing those bits of indebtedness that came from the bank guarantee. They were restructured eventually, not restructured in a formal sense, but they were refinanced at much longer terms and lower interest rates than originally. I
want to go back the period around 2008, because I think you talked about something very important. You said effectively the government started making unconditional guarantees about deposits. I think a lot of people began to do the numbers and say, you've got a banking system that's multiples of GDP. I think at the time, at the peak, it was about 600% of GDP. But in any case, it's very hard, I think, especially when you have a shared currency and you effectively lost your fiscal independence, to make a credible deposit insurance guarantee when you are not the issuer of the currency. And I think that was what Ireland, in a sense, blew the whistle on that, or highlighted that fundamental flaw, which is, I think, present in the Eurozone structure. There isn't a supranational issuer of the currency other than the ECB. So if a national government unilaterally decides that it wants to issue deposit guarantees, it can't do it credibly unless it has the ECB behind it. And I think that this is still an issue that the ECB and indeed Europe as a whole is still grappling with.
Well, deposit guarantee for the first 100,000 is one thing. Sweeping deposit guarantee for everything. And of course, you mentioned 600% of GDP being the size of the banking system, but that included many offshore banks which were not guaranteed. So although the size of the banking system was large, it was similar to several other Euro area countries. And you're right in saying that if these guarantees are actually called for a very large sum, then the national authorities can't meet them. But the important thing is that, and what was not recognized, is the importance of continuous supervision to make sure that the possible exposure of the banking system to losses could never get very big. It's one thing to say, your guarantees will not be credible. They will be credible if the banks are well supervised and if their capital is sufficient to allow them to absorb.
Well, I would take some issue with that only because, for example, arguably you had the same problems in the United States. You had a lot of toxic manure, shall we put it politely, in the U.S. banking system, and maybe in the U.K. banking system as well. But you didn't have bank runs because in the U.S. you, of course, have a U.S. Treasury that can back the FDIC by issuing dollars, and similarly in the U.K., which obviously has a banking system which is multiples of GDP. You've got the Bank of England, which has the currency issuing abilities that is not present with the Central Bank of Ireland.
I think where the difference is not quite as you put it, but slightly differently. The ECB, of course, can provide the liquidity, but at a certain point, it may find itself dragged into a political arena where it is providing so much liquidity, which is actually de facto solvency support. Of course, in the United States, the net losses of the banking system, as imposed on the fiscal accounts, were nil, as far as I know. They looked as if they were going to be out. The banks were bailed out, but the actual fiscal cost, direct fiscal cost, whereas in Ireland, I'm not saying it wasn't damaging. Of course, it's hugely damaging. But in terms of what we're talking about, which is, can you pay up on the guarantee? They could, because in the end, they didn't actually have to pay anything. In Ireland, the pay up was 25% of GDP,
which is effectively the point. People like, for example, Paul de Grauw used to make that point all the time, that if the ECB was prepared to use its bazooka, you don't specify a number. You just say we're going to guarantee the bonds, for example, guarantee the deposits, and in so doing, you have the most credible backstop you can possibly imagine.
To some extent, what has been achieved since the famous whatever it takes speech, the OMT, the ECB has waived that bazooka. Not for bank debt, of course, because the idea of resolving and bailing in.
No, but you're right.
They have said, we have this bazooka, and if countries are well managed,
we'll do whatever it takes.
Whatever it takes, and we will protect the system.
And arguably, the reason why they've never had to use it is precisely because for the first time you had the currency issuing party saying we will stand behind this guarantee, whereas beforehand they had used other political fig leaves, the ESM or the EFSF, all of which had finite amounts of money. So the markets could always call their bluff, so to speak.
Yeah, so that at the same time, the ECB has always made it very clear that this would be conditional on the countries that are under stress being in a program that assures that this is not going to turn into a transfer from one country to another.
Do you think, though, in some ways that the two measures operate somewhat at variance or in contradiction with each other, in the sense that the ECB says, yes, we will backstop your bonds, but in turn you have to control your public spending. And of course, if you implement austerity measures at a time when recessionary pressures are already very intense, you actually can have the perverse effect of expanding that public debt. So it's a bit like taking a patient off the drip and breaking its legs and then putting them back in the hospital bed again.
I think you have to think about two layers. You have to think about the central banking layer and the role and limitations of the mandate of the central bank. Yes, it has a mandate to protect the system, but no, it doesn't have a mandate to take money from one corner and give it to another without a political say-so. Now, that isn't to say that central banking actions, monetary policy actions, do have distributional effects, both within countries and between countries, but not this very explicit idea of a transfer. That has to be passed to the political side, and it has been passed, but arguably, when we look back at this episode, the response of Europe as a whole and the wider, the fiscal arrangements in all of countries of Europe have not really responded to the crisis in a sufficient way.
Perhaps because you didn't have that fiscal mechanism in place, because you have the supranational central bank, but you don't have a supranational treasury.
Exactly, yeah.
And that still hasn't been resolved, and
That's
they're still
right.
grappling with that. I want to go back to another point in time. Ireland, in many respects, is a cautionary tale. Many people have argued that, for example, the problem of the so-called periphery countries, and they've included Ireland, even though it's not a periphery country in many respects, is a problem of fiscal profligacy. Although if you look at Ireland in the mid-2000s, it was called the Celtic Tiger. Its public finances were in very good shape. The budget was balanced. And yet there was a serious problem developing on the private debt side. So
Yes.
It does seem to call into question this whole notion that public profligacy is the source of all the problems that now currently ail the Eurozone.
I think that's absolutely right. Now, the Irish problem was a problem of private over-indebtedness, but that problem did leak into the public finances. The public finances were managed in a way that seemed very prudent, in fact, very cautious, and debt going down to 25% of GDP and so forth, and surpluses in many years. But what was masked was the vulnerability of the revenue sources to a collapse in the property bubble. So the property bubble made property developers rich and did other things, but it also helped the government's budget. And so when that was all removed, the tax revenue from that was removed, the government's budget was very badly exposed. So it wasn't public profligacy, but it ended up in the government's.
They ultimately had to socialize the debt.
Not just because socializing the debt. In fact, far bigger than socializing the debt was the correction to the rest of the government's budget. And this morning I showed a graph which actually highlights that the austerity, if you measure the policy changes that have been taken since 2008, they've reached 30 billion per annum, and that sort of accumulates every year. Whereas, as I said a moment ago, the net fiscal cost of the direct bank bailout was about 40 billion. So, as time goes on, it really is the rest of the government's budget that has suffered, and that has had an impact on people whose whole arrangements have been built around an expectation of continuing public servant salaries, public availability of free public services. They have been squeezed very badly, and it has been very damaging for the fabric of Irish society. But Ireland is resilient and is coming back.
Do you think it is coming back? I mean, the unemployment is still in double digits, is it not? Or?
As we speak, unemployment is in double digits at 10.0. So I look forward to be able to deny that in a month or two time. But 10 is too high, way too high. We have benefited from the actually stronger performance of the UK economy in the last few years in terms of employment, and the US economy, which is a very important part. So peripheral has benefits as well as costs. We're very much connected to the global economy, and we have been able to grow, gain tax revenue, slow the fiscal adjustment. We've had a slower fiscal adjustment than most of the stressed countries, partly because we went into the program very promptly. We had a big cash balance cushion, so we weren't in a panic, we'll do anything, and we were able to stage that fiscal adjustment over a longer period of time. It's been painful, but it's not been as painful as it might have been.
And judging from the number of Irish accents I hear in New York, it seems that there was a large emigration factor, which also helps.
There has been a large emigration. Of course, that's a long tradition in Ireland, but it is a factor that is a matter of concern, because the economy depends on its people and young people, energy and vision, but some will come back.
It's certainly been a big help to us in the States, although I would agree with you. As much as we love having the Irish immigrants coming to the States, it would be much better if they could enjoy the fruits of their own labours in their home country.
We've had a lot of immigration from various parts of the world, Eastern Europe, Africa, China, in the good years, and large numbers of those people have also stayed. So a lot of people expected, oh, well, the Poles will go back to Poland. No, they haven't. They've stayed. They're doing okay.
And as a final question, do you think we have now, are we likely to prevent a recurrence of an Irish-style problem going forward? Are there enough policy mechanisms in place to prevent that?
In the 1980s, we had a big fiscal crisis in Ireland, a fiscal profligacy crisis. The adjustment was very painful. I thought I would never see anything like that in my lifetime again. 30 years later, it happened again. I hope not. We won't make exactly the same mistake the next time. We're trying to learn larger lessons than just narrow ones about banks.
Dr. Honohan, thank you very much for joining us today. Very helpful.
Thank you.